Hey everybody, it's Jamie from Canadian Grit. Welcome. Today we have Canadian author Dr. Adam Shoalts. And right from Mr. Shoalts' website, I'll just read a bit of an introduction. Adam Shoalts is a professional explorer and national best-selling author, elected a Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society for, quote, extraordinary contributions to geography, quote, and completed a nearly 4,000-kilometer solo journey across Canada's Arctic. And we're going to be talking about Mr. Shoalts' new book that's coming out. A geographer and historian, he holds a PhD from McMaster University, has participated in numerous archaeological digs, and undertakes solo expeditions in the most remote wilderness areas. He is the Westaway Explorer in Residence of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and in 2016 was named a national champion of the Trans-Canadian Trail. Declared one of the greatest living explorers by Canadian Geographic, and named Canada's Indiana Jones by the Toronto Star, Adam Shoalts is a professional adventurer and one of Canada's best-selling authors. And again, there's a lot more here, and we're going to go through that too, but one of Canada's greatest modern explorers, most accomplished adventurer, says Global News. Adam Shoalts, 21st century explorer, calmly describes the things he has endured that would drive most people to despair or even madness. Rare insight into the heart and mind of an explorer, and the insatiable hunger for the unknown that both inspires and drives one to the edge. And that's from Colonel Chris Hadfield, who many of you may know as probably the most famous recent Canadian astronaut and commander of the International Space Station. And one of my favorite is, forget keeping up with the Kardashians, try keeping up with this guy. It's so funny. The accolades precede you, but when I read your books, this introduction was just to get us going and to get into, you just got back from the Arctic, but also to paint a picture for our audience, because if anybody's read your books, when I read your books, there's a sense of humility that I really appreciate about you. There's a sense of humanity that I pick up, which I find is really amazing. And you welcome the reader into your danger and your own reflections on danger, things that went wrong, your luck. Honestly, it's just so nice to meet you. And thanks for joining me and making the time. As a history guy, I'm sitting here with your books. And it's just, so this is a special moment for me when I started Canadian Grit, and I'm just so excited to hear about your voyages and whatever you want to talk about today.
Sounds good.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I love your background. That's awesome. Is that a real background?
This here is so I'm literally, So when I started Canadian Grit, it was actually very gritty. So I'm in my basement in a corner with some mattresses. And so this is a favorite rock and roll band, Yes.
Yes.
And so this is an old Walmart towel that was in the basement. And I have an old wooden door behind here and an old swimming towel from my wife, who was a competitive swimmer.
Looks good. I like it.
Thank you.
Blue Jays caps. It's a nice touch. It's very Canadian.
Well, this is what I was going for. I was just, a big thing of what I'm trying to do here is just bring out some information and to highlight people in our communities who are doing some great things.
Awesome.
And so and as a teacher too, I always said to kids, just go and make it. And I don't know how to start a podcast. And I had one student who just said, be yourself. I'm starting with what I've got. And the important thing was starting. And if you never start, it never goes anywhere. And going back to your work, just again to preface, is that, your books inspired a lot of what's happening here. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
So that's great.
Yeah, anytime an author hears they have an audience, I'm just happy about that.
Well, yeah, and I understand that too. So I've made questions. I got your books here. I could talk with you probably forever about anything. I respect your time. And hopefully, in the future, we can connect more too, because just with so many overlaps, and I think that, Canada could really use your stories, your history, stuff you do is changing the world, which is pretty amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So that's because I'm pumped to talk to you about your brand new book, which I've pre-ordered and I can't wait to read it. So this is exciting for me.
You're one of the first. I think I've only done I think you're the the third podcast I've done this fall. So you're still very early. I have a whole bunch
Oh,
scheduled later, but this is kind of a scoop because the book is so new. It is
yeah,
not even
yeah,
available yet. It's coming out in stores on Tuesday. But I was excited to actually talk to someone ahead of time who's a historian, the subject matter,
yeah.
and share it. I mean, I think even though you haven't read the book yet, it's just organic. A lot of the themes, the wilderness, Canadian history, the Arctic, the North, the mystery. I'm hoping that, this is a subject that will appeal to a lot of different people, not just people like us who love history and the outdoors, right?
Absolutely. And again, you've inspired me. I also have started writing some shorter. Uh, in your vein, I took a German myth and fairy tale course, and also did a paper on the Wagner Nibelungenlied, and I'm very interested in Norse mythology.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah, like so. This is when I was reading. I just left it upstairs.
The Whisper on the Night Wind?
Yeah, the Whisper on the Night Wind. Sorry, thank you. And all of the stuff about the Yeti and the Lugaroo. And I'm just, this is it because I did a paper on how the turn of German nationalism, or before 1871, and what Richard Wagner saw as the ability to unify the German nation of German-speaking peoples through creating a collective history. And he literally just sort of sniped the story and the Norse mythology and changed the character names to Siegfried, and the Rheingold. And again, it's the story of the Lord of the Rings. It's all there, and to unite the people and to see through history, teleologically, how that's been misappropriated or misunderstood. But also, I think a huge part of what Canadian Grit is and what you lit me onto is the idea of our shared Canadian history. That is the idea of our nation, what makes us Canadian. And I think that in your books, certainly The Adventures, but when I read A History of Canada in 10 maps, it just absolutely blew my mind as a historian, because I was just like, I still have so much to do. But the way you manage to weave history with meaning and all of the voices and the perspectives, that's something I really seek to emulate. So again, when I started and I was like, well, how can I start? What do I know? So, well, I know music, I know some rock and roll, and I know this. And I actually took History of Canada in 10 maps, and I used that sort of as the framing structure for the historical episodes that I've created. Your book, 10 years ago, I was going to Algonquin Park. I bought Alone Against the North. And I'm reading it, and I was like, Adam Shoalts, and I was reading about your credentials a bit, and I'm like, this guy's got to be in his 50s. And I honestly, because I'm like, how have I never heard of this guy? I have my finger on a lot of this pulse and stuff in this field, and I said, I do not know. And this is 10 years ago, right after that came out. And to find out, I think you're just a couple of years older. I'm born in 1987. And so when I
I'm
read that,
86.
86. Okay, so you're the same age as my one brother, Jeremy. And so when I was reading this, I was like, I could be doing something like this. And it wasn't that what you were doing is what I wanted to do, but it was just, it pushed me to be like, wow, it's not too late. And literally I went and started my PhD. And a lot of that was, it could have been easy. What's the point? But seeing the idea of doing a PhD, I didn't want to sort of go into the ivory tower. My goal is to democratize information, whether it be through just making a basement studio. So that was a bit about me, just to preface why, just beyond wanting to have you here, it really is about the history, and what you're doing is really, I see you as a role model to a lot of people, including myself. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that is my goal of my books is to reach as wide an audience as possible. I never, even though I did my PhD, I didn't want to write history books that only 7 people in university or academia would ever read. I thought, life is so short. There's so many fascinating stories out there. I want to actually focus on things that hopefully will appeal to people from all walks of life, whether you like history or hate it. The first rule I always say in writing a book is do not be boring. Life is too short to be boring. There's thousands of books. Even if you had all the time in the universe, you'd never be able to even scratch the surface of all the books that are out there. So every book I write, whether it's an adventure story like crossing 4,000 kilometers of the Arctic alone, or more of a history book like The Whisper on the Night Wind, my rule of thumb for every single chapter is don't waste the reader's time. Make this the most exciting, interesting thing you possibly can. And that's what I try to do. So with The Whisper on the Night Wind, that was a story that's, I think, appropriate for this time of year, getting into October, a little bit spooky,
Absolutely.
a campfire legend, things that go bump in the night. We've all wondered about that. Anyone who's ever slept alone in the Canadian wilderness in a tent, what's that sound coming out? Is that an owl? Is that something else? We've all heard tales of Sasquatch and Wendigo. So I wanted to do a deep dive into that subject matter, but to look at it from um, a scholarly perspective, right? Try to bring some research to bear on it, but make it still a fun adventure. And that's hopefully what that book did.
You've really made me question the term strangers. Because everywhere you go, and especially where the falcon flies, a few of your adventures, and one of my favorite pictures of you was actually out in front of the wind turbines. And just hearing about how people help, but not only that is that you include those people in your story. So I don't think you're the type of guy who's going to come on here and talk about all of your accolades. And that's not necessarily why we're here, but I just really want to put that out there for people to understand how lucky we are to have people like you inspiring us and doing this. So thank you for being here again, and welcome to Canadian Grit.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jamie. Thanks for having me on the show. It's funny you should mention that that's your one of your favorite photos that you've seen of me, because the one where I'm on Lake Erie, I was canoeing to the Arctic from Lake Erie. The other week, my wife happened to mention to me just randomly out of the blue that that's her favorite photo of me too. And
Come on.
yes, and it's a photo where, of course, you can't really see my face and I'm far away, so I don't
Yeah,
be alarmed
yeah,
that my wife
exactly.
said that of all the photos, that's the favorite one of me, the one that was taken at a considerable distance. But yeah, as you mentioned with strangers, that was a photo taken of me by someone who'd been a stranger, well, at least 24 hours previous to the photo. I just randomly met him as I was
Mhm.
canoeing to the Arctic, a wonderful guy named Brad Wood, who was nice enough to let me camp in his backyard because I had nowhere else to camp and it was a bit of a stormy night. And it turned out he was a bit
Yes.
of a photographer, and he snapped that photo of me as I was
Yeah.
setting off to canoe another 3,000 kilometers or so up to the
Oh, here
Arctic.
we are.
But
I'm just gonna open. It is in the book here. And again, it will show up better after it's done loading. But this is the picture here. We can see Adam and it paddling on Lake Erie with wind turbines in New York State behind me. Photo credit by Brad Wood, who is of Coburg, I believe you said,
Port
or
Colborne,
not
yeah.
Oh, Paul Coburn. Yes, that's correct. Okay.
Yeah,
And
usually most of the photos that I feature on my social media or in my books are just selfies pulled out of my GoPro, which is mounted on my canoe as I'm canoeing through rapids or bushwhacking. But it was nice for once to actually have a stranger who was generous enough to take the photo of me, show some perspective, because I was a couple kilometers offshore on the lake when I was paddling by there, and he actually reached out to me on Instagram with those photos after my journey, and said, "Hey, if you want to use them, have at it." And he was nice enough to let me print them in the book. So I think there's about three or four photos that he took of me on the journey that feature in that book, Where the Falcon Flies.
yeah, and that again, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you got to the Peace Bridge and I think there's a scene where you pull your canoe over, and was he maybe not there as well, or
Yeah,
there was somebody? Was that the same guy?
that's the same guy. That
Did
was
he?
Brad Wood, and there was a couple other
Yeah,
people.
yes. And that part to me was again, so for me, when you were talking about that whole scene in Niagara Falls and the police escort, that was one of the most vivid. I'm like, man, what an amazing story of the police coming, and then all of these things that just sort of it leads to you getting to where you need to go, and the people who are involved. I love how you also include them in showing how these journeys you plan are often, it takes everyone you run into sometimes as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I try to do, justice to everyone I cross paths with in my journeys that I've written about in my books. So I remember in my journey from Lake Erie to the Arctic, I mean, to get to the Arctic, I was used to traveling in remote wilderness places. Just a couple of years earlier, I'd done my 4,000-kilometer solo journey across the Arctic, which involved long periods of time without even seeing another human being. But that journey from Lake Erie to the Arctic was, of course, totally different. To get to the Arctic, I had to canoe and camp in some of the biggest cities in Canada, home to millions of people like Toronto and Montreal. I had absolutely no idea ahead of time where I would camp for the night because it was impossible to predict where I'd end up with storms and big waves on the Great Lakes and everything else beyond
Hmm.
my control. Some nights I went to sleep, for example, one night under the Burlington Skyway, just outside of
To me,
Hamilton.
And again, all of those stops, and I think for me, the way you describe those things, I feel the anxiety of having traveled and not the way you are doing, but to have slept on a floor somewhere, but to the Burlington Skyway, I mean, you drive over it, but you never actually look down and think somebody's going to be paddling through the Hamilton Harbor. And the way you personify nature, and you see that, I think that's really special because a lot of these adventures are solo, and the way you turn, for example, Great Lake freighters into almost an adversary. And when I went paddling, my wife and I went to Gordon Island, and I just went out on my kayak by myself into the St. Lawrence, and I had some real lessons there, just even in calm water, as I was looking at these shipping lanes and boats, and then just to have even that minimal amount of experience to sort of appreciate what you're looking at, because growing up in Muskoka on the Muskoka River, Lake Muskoka was considered big water, and then you see Lake Superior, Lake Erie,
Yeah.
and you're out there paddling these places, and the scene where you're going around the breakwall in Port Coburn, I was there with you, and the fact that you share those as well, I know it really draws the reader in, and it puts that level of adventure and risk that you're willing to take, really is special to get that story and that experience vividly and realistically.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention, canoeing on big water, whether it's Lake Muskoka or the Arctic Ocean or the Great Lakes. I would have to say that's maybe one of the things I enjoy the least about doing those big journeys, even though I frequently seem to find myself canoeing miles from land, riding along with big waves or canoeing in really cold conditions in the far north. But it's probably the most anxiety inducing thing that I do. I mean, I get asked that question all the time. People will say, what's the scariest moment? Is when a polar bear charged you or when a grizzly bear? How do you deal with sleeping alone around polar bears? But I always say, no, to be honest, like the scariest moments I've had a few scary moments and close calls with bears. But the thing that has given me the most nightmares, the most stress is actually just canoeing far from land across big bodies of water. Because when you're in a little tiny canoe, you are very much at the mercy of the elements. When those waves get big, there's not a lot you can do with, breaking whitecaps and surf. I had some tense moments on both Lake Erie and on Lake Ontario on that journey. And then further north, when I was in Labrador, towards the
Yes.
end of my journey, some of those lakes, even if they're not as big, when the wind picks up in Labrador, boy, does it ever howl. And
Is that right?
it generates huge whitecaps. And I remember I was like a kilometer out from land. That was maybe my most white knuckle moment. I was really thinking, no matter what I do now, I'm going to capsize. I'm going to swamp and go into this water. So I was psychologically preparing myself for a very long and difficult swim, even with the life jacket on. Try to
Yep.
salvage as much of my gear as I could get and paddle for the shore. Somehow or another, I mean, knock on wood, probably just pure luck, I managed to keep that canoe upright over the waves and just sort of ride the waves. Fortunately, they were coming from a tailwind, so I rode the
Mm.
waves all the way back to the shore there. And then I don't normally want a canoe in high winds, so I stayed on shore and set up my tent in the middle of the day, and just waited there until the evening when the waves died down. And then I continued. But I mean, whether it is Lake Muskoka or some other lake, I mean, you never want to make light of it because, yeah, even on a lake like Lake Muskoka, things can get dangerous pretty quickly in high wind. It doesn't take a whole lot to overwhelm a canoe. So my mantra, my philosophy always when doing those journeys is kind of like respect Mother Nature. And when Mother Nature is saying now is the time to rest, don't push the envelope and just say, okay, I'm going to make the best of this scenario. I might be stuck on this point on this lake for 3 days because of high winds, relentless. But what can I do to actually make the most of these next 3 days? I can rehydrate because I'm pretty parched from all the hard paddling. But now I can actually, gather some driftwood, make a fire here, even if it's in the Arctic. There's usually driftwood around, and boil
Mhm.
water, make some tea, recharge my batteries, both metaphorically and literally, because I have a solar panel. So I'll mount that on a rock, charge up my GoPro batteries, get caught up on my journal. I haven't been writing as much as I would like. I try to write my books in the moment. So, describe things
Oh,
happening, study my maps. I've spread out my topographic maps on the rocks there and try to commit to memory as much as I can where I'm going to be going the next 2 to 3 days because that will save
okay.
time. Now I'll know, like, okay, head northwest along this lake and then look from a river
Mhm.
coming into a
I
bay
see.
with an island. So I'll do all those things, dry out all my clothing that's been wet, and just sort of sleep as much as I can, because oftentimes on a long journey, I won't get a lot of chance to sleep as much as I normally would like. But if I'm
Under
pinned
the
down,
Burlington Skyway, it's hard to sleep, you mean?
I had an okay sleep under there. I was a little bit apprehensive about some of the locals, but
I know.
everyone I met turned out to be incredibly kind. On that entire journey, crossing paths with hundreds of different people, I didn't meet anyone who wasn't anything other than kind and even enthusiastic about helping me, a perfect stranger, get to the Arctic. And a lot of the times, I mean, they didn't know anything about me. They didn't even really know necessarily where I'd come from or how long into the journey I was, but it was just they saw a guy with a canoe, and there's something wonderful about the kindness of Canadians when they meet a stranger traveling with a canoe. It's just like, what can we do to help you? Do you need somewhere to camp? Can we give you food? Can I help you portage? Get that canoe back down to the water. I had to get around some obstacles in downtown Montreal. But yeah, that was the sort of the blessing in disguise, is that all those strangers I
Yeah.
met with on my travels actually ended up to be friends I just didn't know yet, who are willing to help me on my journey.
Yeah, and the one gentleman, I can't remember if you knew his name, but I think he helped you throw your canoe over after the park official told you were crazy, and he stood there. And so I think what my point is, when I read your books, I think where again the self awareness that you have, there's another scene where you had to go out past a point, I think on Lake Erie, and you could see people at shore probably wondering who's that crazy guy out there. I think you're very aware of how people are going to perceive you, but I think therein is also something that when people meet you, they are probably so, here's a guy with a canoe who just told me at Niagara Falls he's going to paddle to Labrador. I think that's so exceptionally wonderful, even as a dream, that you're unlocking in people something else. And that's maybe secondarily through the writing and your work, that's how you've inspired things like this. Because I want to share your story, because I think, or stories, that there's still somebody just willing to go out alone against the North. Is, that book, when I was going paddling with my friend Sam, we would go to Algonquin Park, as, his family had a 99-year lease and still do on Lake Kayashkokwi.
Wow.
And we would do just a couple day portages. And a couple times ago I went up, I was like, I need a book to read. It's going to be quiet. And I just picked up your book by chance, and it really just changed sort of everything. That here's a guy who's, hey, I'm going to literally put on a backpack and go look for a river that's never been named. So I guess too, there's a question for you, Adam, is how do you pick of all the, and I mean, we can get into your new book, but I mean, I've Beyond the Trees, Where the Falcon Flies, A History of Canada in 10 Maps, an amazing, concise version of history that's not ever been told that I've ever seen. The maps are beautiful. But because you're only one guy doing all of these things, how do you pick the next adventure? So that's a big question. But if, for example, so you just come back from the Arctic, why don't you tell us about that in your new book, and all about the impetus for how you got there from Where the Falcon Flies, because we get to have another book from you in the same year.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I should say is that almost every day of the week, 365 days of the year, I try to get outside and have some mini or micro adventure, even if it's just in the backyard. I'm lucky that I have a forest right around my house. So I'm constantly going outside. And that's kind of like what I think I've really discovered, is that you don't necessarily have to travel thousands of kilometers or disappear for months in the wild to have a real rewarding adventure in the great outdoors. So literally yesterday, I was just around my house here in the woods, and I was finding puffballs. And
Yeah.
that was exciting to me. I was with my son, who's 4 years old. An adventure for him, but we were collecting gem-studded puffballs, which are edible, and bringing them back to the house to cook and eat. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of an adventure in itself. And many people around the world enjoy foraging for wild edibles, whether it's mushrooms or plants or berries. It's kind of fun in itself, and it's kind of like a miniature version of what I do when I'm on a big expedition for months. You're going out into the wild to look for something, and trying to find it. And there may be obstacles along the way to find those puffballs. Maybe we had to get through some thorns on the raspberry bushes. We had to climb over a fallen down tree, and then there's the puffballs. So it's like a miniature little adventure. But just for that hour, it's like you're escaping from the humdrum of emails and everyday life, and reminding yourself how much fun it can be to simply get out into the great outdoors, like your kids again, catching frogs or fishing under the local bridge, doing these sorts of things. So
It's so simple. It's all right there. We have everything. And just as a quick second there, you're talking about kids. How many kids have you got, sir?
I have three now. My newest one's still pretty fresh. He's a 5-month-old baby, but I have three boys who keep me on my toes. That's kind of the biggest adventure of all, being a parent to three rambunctious little boys, ages 5 months, 2, and 4. But it's great, and I get them out in the woods as much as I can. They don't come on big expeditions with me because I'd be a little bit nervous taking them around
Polar
polar
bear
bears and
bait.
grizzlies. But maybe one day when they're bigger. But yeah, that's a lot of fun as well.
Well, and I would just I want to just ask you that because as a parent, a fresh parent myself, Wyatt's 9 weeks now or just 2 months, and we've had an
Congratulations.
adventure. Thank you so much. It's been life changing, and I totally agree that the adventure that it's created, and I'm trying also to think of ways, when he's in these moments of being inconsolable or crying, I'm just trying to, even for myself, put myself in, okay, we're going to be camping someday. I'm going to be teaching you something fun. And this is all part of each stage. But just, I think, not to make my PhD, sustainable coping strategies, a big thing that I see in your book, I think that most people, maybe without being able to articulate it, maybe, or say the words, is that the champion mindset that you exude and exhibit. And whether or not, and again, this isn't just to say that you're going out there and doing this explicitly on purpose, but just in that story you just shared, from what I see, and this is my storytelling, is I see somebody who has the end goal in mind at all times. Even when you talk in your books about hardships and bears and whitecaps, you always bring the reader back to the same hope, I think, that you hold, that you're gonna in every single moment, whether it's white knuckle or you're having to wait out the storm. That's perfect mindfulness, I think, that you exhibit. Your ability to compartmentalize and to stay focused on the end goal. Well, we're gonna have to get through some raspberry bushes. There are gonna be bugs on the way to the Arctic. Those are realistic planning that you've accounted for, but it hasn't taken away from the fact that you're still gonna go through the tough or the hard stuff to get to the delicious puffs.
Yes, yes. Well, that's just a backyard adventure, but I never really tackled your bigger question, which is how do I actually decide or come up with the big adventures, some of which have become books. But as I was saying, I try to do an adventure almost every day, just getting out in the woods. Maybe it's looking for a bird or a particular type of tree. Like, there's a big old red oak in this woods, and I love old growth forest, so I want to go find it. But I try to come up with ideas that captivate me first and foremost. That's something that I want to put my heart and soul in, and blood, sweat, and tears for months out in the wild. And if it captivates me, hopefully it'll captivate other people as well. So I come up with all kinds of expedition ideas, ranging from one of my current projects is photographing all of Canada's different snake species in the wild. It's amazing. We have 33 different species of snake in Canada. Yet if you talk to the average Canadian, even Canadians who love the great outdoors, they struggle to name even, 4 or 5 of them. Everyone knows garter snakes and maybe rattlesnakes and milk snakes. But many other snake species, they don't get a lot of attention here in Canada. We don't really associate snakes with the great outdoors in Canada. And, to me, I thought reptiles, maybe they don't get the love they deserve, but also this is something that can appeal to kids no matter where they live in Canada. Even if you're in a big city like Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto, maybe you're not necessarily going to get to the Arctic this weekend. But the neat thing is that you have different species of snake, even in those big cities or close to them, and you could see them in your local park or your local conservation area. And many of those species are endangered. In some cases, there's only a few hundred left in the wild. So I kind of wanted to bring attention to them. And I tried to do it in a way that would appeal to classrooms. So I wanted to make it kind of educational in the sense that I could take photographs of these snakes, describe a little bit about the adventure on the way, where they live, what kind of habitat they need, what threatens them, and maybe what we can do to help them. So that's one adventure that's totally different than, say, going off to the Arctic and looking for a lost explorer who vanished almost without a trace 100 years ago, somewhere in uncharted territory in the high Arctic, among icebergs and polar bears, and saying, okay, I'm going to find this guy's letters that
It's
have never been
crazy. It's
published,
so
and track down his route, retrace his steps, no matter what it takes, go for months and try to find his old campsites, his old trail, and establish what happened to him and tell the story of his life as best as I can. So they're both adventures that revolve around my love of nature and the great outdoors and exploring and mystery, all these things. But yeah, that's how I kind of come up with them. And probably like a lot of people, I'll write down on a notepad with a pen like a list of 10 ideas that I have, and I'll kind of weigh them and say, okay, well, what can I do with this? What would the budget be for that?
Mm.
Is that possible? Can I do that? But I have kind of a dream list of trips that I would love to do, and then I work through them, and I focus on things that kind of, to a certain extent, come back to my own field of expertise, which is history, archaeology, historical geography. So something like looking for a lost explorer, it's like, well, that's maybe something I can do. I've got the skill set. I can go into the archives. I can find his journal. I can look for artifacts. I can do something like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something like that. I can also do projects like Where the Falcon Flies, which is the name I gave to my book, which is simply a personal journey. I want to see, could I actually go from my doorstep in Southern Ontario? Could I walk out the front door with my backpack and my canoe and basically canoe from my front yard to the Arctic? The whole idea that it's
Standing there staring at the stars. Hey, I wonder if I could just paddle, to Florida from Bracebridge was like 2,300 kilometers and almost took 24 hours. So when I look at Where the Falcon Flies, a 3,400 kilometer odyssey from my doorstep to the Arctic, I'm immediately thinking, well, you've driven to Florida and halfway back, but you didn't drive, you paddled. That's how my mind works. And then I look at the map and I'm just saying, well, that, it's unbelievable. And just to see and to help people understand that process is, well, and for me, just out of pure interest, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it was slow and steady wins the race. That's what I kept telling myself. Don't worry about 3,400 kilometers, just worry about the next 34. If I can get across this bay or down this river, I can make a camp, get warm and dry, and I've done enough for that day. And tomorrow's a whole new day and a whole new set of challenges. So I take it one step at a time, slow and steady. And before I knew it, I'd left Southern Ontario and I was among caribou and polar bears in the Arctic. I got there eventually. But the underlying idea behind that, it was one thing to say, could I travel from my doorstep to the Arctic and follow the Arctic birds like peregrine falcons that migrate from Southern Ontario to the Arctic. But the real idea, the underlying message or theme behind that was I was really concerned about the loss of forests and wetlands and wild places in Southern Canada. As everyone knows who lives here, we've seen amazing development pressure in the South. We've seen, forests clear cut and wetlands paved over and green space turned into suburban sprawl and parking lots and Starbucks and all the rest of it. And I thought, yeah, I could go out and say, please don't do that, but it doesn't really seem to resonate. You just end up
That's right.
preaching to the
Yep.
choir. So I
That's
thought,
right.
well, how do, people love the Arctic and Canadians. I mean, it looms large in our national mythology, and
Mhm.
we all understand the importance of protecting polar bears and Arctic wildlife. But I thought, how do you make someone feel connected to that? How do they relate to it? How does it relate to their own backyard, their own neighborhood, their own community, their own city block? And there's a way that it does, and I'm not even really being metaphorical. In a really tangible
No, you're not.
sense,
Yeah, yeah. You characterize it in the book very well. The idea of progress when you're looking at Burlington and all these different places, that's another thing that I mentioned. I have lots of notes on this book, but you're in every instance how you do a shout out to the ornithology sanctuaries, the bird sanctuaries, all of these places as you travel. You as an objective reader, while I was reading it, before this, one of the things that struck me was the value of this and how you present the fact that, through history, the 401 and these highways have literally been paved over Indigenous trails and routes of trade, that have existed forever. Yet Canada, Britain, France, these were all seafaring empires. And that from your vantage point on these rivers, you're seeing our Canadian mythology and history that is often now hidden away due to its proximity to water, what you, I think, at one point called the highways of the France and the Dominion of Canada. And that as you paddle through those areas, you describe the change of eco zones. And so you're bringing in all of that in a very layered but approachable way, what we'd probably call interdisciplinary approaches in pedagogy. But that's it. John Dewey and experience. Learning is meaningless unless people can put themselves in it. And you really have, in my opinion, been successful at making that. You're creating something that, again, all of these things, we see a polar bear on the toonie, we see, or even on a Coca-Cola commercial. But there are polar bears in Churchill, but how many people ever get to go there?
Yeah, well, that was the idea I was driving at, which is it's all interconnected.
Yeah.
So even if you live in downtown Toronto in a condo, there's a part of the Arctic there, not necessarily a polar bear, but there's Arctic birds. Over 100 Arctic species of bird migrate south every year. I mean, not only peregrine falcons, which is what the title of the book comes from, but, snow geese, tundra swans, semi-pollinated sandpipers, they all come south. So that little city park just down the road might be where some Arctic birds are literally overwintering before flying back up to Ellesmere Island or the tundra of Nunavut and the Yukon in the Northwest Territories. I thought that's really neat. No matter where you live in Canada, in the South, in the North, you can see the same wildlife, the same animals on these journeys. And it's a reminder of how it's all interconnected. So yeah, I wanted to tell kind of on a grand scale the story of Canada's geography and weave it all together with history and people. And, what does it look like today? If you were to do this journey, you're going to see glittering skyscrapers and busy highways, but you also see places that haven't changed much in hundreds of years and catch those fascinating glimpses into the world we lost, into a vanished past. And whenever I would do that, pass through old growth forest outside Quebec City as it was going up the slopes, I'd say, this is amazing, these sugar maple trees or these birch, they've been here hundreds of years and here they are still flourishing to this day. And, if trees could talk, what are some of the stories they would tell? So all of that is part of the story in the book. And yeah, I'm always fascinated by that idea. Like, hey, you can be in downtown Toronto, but imagine if you went back not that long ago, 230 years, there could be black bear and even elk and, mountain lions, cougars, wandering around that same intersection that's now thousands of people on the way to work. So that's kind of like what I tried to do in that book is make it an adventure
beautiful.
story, but also make it a sort of, this is why I think, we should protect these places, these green spaces we still have in the South, because they're all interconnected. They remind us
Yeah.
of what once was, and they provide homes for the birds that still come south.
And that's exactly where we live. And to see how we are trying to conserve these spaces, because even the Lake Simcoe conservation efforts that are going on here, as well as a watershed that feeds, Barrie South to Lake Ontario, and how important these watersheds are. And what can we do locally? Talking about road salt and the effects of even businesses using road salts or salts outside of on the sidewalks, and these sorts of effects long term. But your books show us that continuity and change and how close it is if we can just imagine. And when I teach students in Europe, one of the big things is I always say, you're in a new city, no phones, look up. And with what you're saying about the birds, and I've always loved birds as well too, but I don't know, to look up and I say, wow, I love birds, but to think that could be someone on the way to the Arctic is pretty special. So your new book, I saw your video on Instagram yesterday. You were unboxing was that yesterday that you received a shipment of your new book?
Yes.
Yeah.
The author of the book usually gets it about a week or so before it actually comes out in stores. So I have
Okay.
I have some copies, the author copies of my own new book, which is coming out on October 7th. So very soon.
Okay. And
I
so
think I have one here. I can pick it up.
yes, please.
I don't know.
There it is.
Vanish Beyond the Map, The Mystery of Lost Explorer Hubert Darrell. And it's
beautiful, the coloring and everything. I don't know who does your cover art. It catches the eye. The dark purples, and again, I love visuals, so that is something that immediately makes me want to read it.
yeah, I gotta say, it's probably one of my nicest. I mean, all the covers are really nice. It's Penguin Random House. They have a graphics design department.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Different people work on it, but this book, yeah, it's actually got more photos and maps in it than any book I've ever published before. We've got some color maps, and we've got
Oh, wow.
lots of color photos actually in this book. I think about 50, don't quote me, but there's around 50 color photographs in this book, and lots of maps put in throughout the book, which were important to the story because it's a mystery book. It's the story of an
Yes.
explorer who
Yes.
disappeared in the Arctic, and wherever possible, I'd get black and white photographs from his journeys or his expeditions. And then I would literally go to that same spot more than 100 years later and retrace the route and photograph it and show, like, I think this is where he was camped, right on this point looking out over the water. This is exactly what he described in his journal. Here I am in this same spot. Oh, look, this stump is the same stump he cut 112 years ago. In the South, of course, if you cut a stump, it will never last very long because of the humidity in July and August. It will rapidly rot away. But the amazing thing about the
Oh,
Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle, it's so cold that everything is preserved. It's like a time capsule. So you can literally
oh
cut a
wow.
stump in the 1800s and it might still be there even to this day in 2025. Usually you can see the cut marks from an axe or a hatchet on it. There might be lichens growing over it, which is usually a clue to how old it is, because lichens grow very, very slowly in the Arctic, usually just, 0.1 millimeter a year, if that. So if it's got,
Wow.
dense growth of lichens on the stump someone cut and it's on the exact spot that someone wrote in their journal, it's all these breadcrumb clues that I tried to follow. And I wanted to show the reader that. I described it, but I was like, we got to put as many photos, color photos, into this book as we can. And I managed to squeeze in about 50 or so into that book.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, Hubert, Darrell, if you just were to give us a little bit, so earlier we talked about how you pick adventures. You have a list of adventures, and I really like that you did that. What about him, or how did you discover him and decide that was going to be the project that you chose at the time?
Yeah. I mean, there's something about lost explorers, whether it's Franklin or Percy Fawcett in the Amazon. Lost explorers is a subject that fascinates the imagination. But I had happened 14 years ago, back in 2011, I had stumbled upon a lost explorer who I felt topped all the others in terms of mystery, fascination, and how extraordinary his story really was. And the incredible thing about it is this is the greatest explorer no one has ever heard of. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. If you Googled him, nothing would come back. Now, of course, that's changing because I literally just published a big book on the guy. But at the
Yeah.
time, there was like almost nothing available on him. He was a legend in his own time. Some of the greatest explorers, guys like Amundsen, the first man to the South Pole, first man to sail through the Northwest Passage, they spoke of Hubert Darrell in awe, saying, he's a polar explorer on a different level entirely. Amundsen, this Norwegian explorer, first man, as I said, to the South Pole, he literally said, with Darrell, with men like him, I could go to the moon, as a testament to how much respect and even awe he held him in. And he was hardly alone in that assessment. I found Darrell's name would constantly come up in the diaries of other explorers, other travelers in the North. It seemed like 100+ years ago, everyone knew who he was, from Alaska to Hudson's Bay to the high Arctic. He really was a legend, a wanderer, a solitary wanderer who would go for thousands of miles in all kinds of conditions, dead of winter. And he was respected and admired by pretty much everyone I could find. Hardened whaling captains on the Beaufort Sea, grizzled old prospectors in the Klondike, indigenous leaders, indigenous chiefs of different indigenous nations. He could speak at least 2 different indigenous languages fluently. Mounties who tried to hire him as a special constable to lead their sled dog patrols on foot because he had almost like superhuman iron stamina. He would walk ahead of the dog sleds in the snow just to break the trail so they could follow. And he would do this for literally thousands of miles. So he was this fascinating character, and yet there was almost nothing available about him. I'd look him up in the library. No one's ever written a book about him, and he'd been
Mm.
forgotten about. So I said, I want to learn more. Turned out that he had disappeared in 1910. He was born in 1874. I ended up finding his baptism records. He'd
Oh
grown up
wow.
in Manitoba on a farm there in a little remote place called Birtle, Manitoba, a town today of about 600 people and even smaller in his day in the 1800s. And he'd learned his skills in the outdoors, hunting, fishing, and trapping on the farm there. And then, while he was still a very young man, the Klondike Gold Rush had erupted, and like thousands of others, he went north to the Yukon to seek his fortune in the Klondike. He never struck it rich, he never found gold, but it was among those mountains and rivers that he discovered his real talent, his real calling, which was
Mm.
exploration and map making. He was a self-taught map maker, self-taught explorer, and he became a wanderer, this solitary figure who wandered among the mountains and, trapped, hunted, guided other people, but he quickly became a legend across the North. And then he vanished in 1910 very mysteriously. And there were so many fascinating aspects to his story, a lot of drama. I mean, times it seemed like a Hollywood movie. He got in fights with people. There were people murdered. It was
Yeah.
incredible. But it turned out that he had kept a diary, and he'd kept letters, and he had mailed those to his sisters and to his family. And they had held on to these letters and diaries, and they had kept them for over half a century. And then when they passed away, they donated them to a local archive where they essentially collected dust for another 50 years, right up until today when I stumbled upon
Waiting,
them and said, yeah, this
waiting
is
for
what I
you.
need. So I literally, with a magnifying glass, went through his original letters by hand. Many of them were faded, hard to make out, water stained. The pencil writing wasn't clear, but it took a while, a bit of a slog. But I transcribed what he was saying, and I was able to use that as the blueprint to go to the wilderness, go into the Arctic and retrace his route and try to unravel his life story, which I tried to tell in the book, and ultimately solve the mystery. What happened to him? Why did he vanish? Did he go away voluntarily, just build a cabin, turn his back on the world? Was he murdered? Did he fall through the ice? What happened to him? So many dangers inherent alone in the Arctic. I tried to unravel what had happened to him. And I found lots
Mm.
of clues. I'd go through all the other journals and diaries from other people who were in the North at the time. Again, ship's captains, missionaries, other explorers, Northwest Mounted Police records. I went to their archive in Ottawa, went through the old case file on Hubert Darrell, how he disappeared, and tried to put it all together. And that's the story of the book. It's kind of a two-part book. The first part is a history book, the story of his life.
Oh.
Second part is a story of my personal quest to figure out where he vanished, his last camp in the Arctic, pinpoint that, go to the location, canoe there in the summer, and try to, search for any trace of him, which is what I
Mm.
ended up doing.
That's amazing. And all of this is just, I think when you're talking about the Klondike and the North, there's going to be a lot of people pulled in just by that. In 2019, went up to Alaska in the Yukon, and I got to spend a couple of weeks driving back. But prior to that, I read Klondike by Pierre Burton. And, just reading about the pass through Skagway and the history involved in what happened in the Yukon and in Whitehorse and all of these places in this history. My question is how, or it's probably in the book, and I don't want you to spoil anything. However, I mean, why do you think history forgot someone that was as influential to other explorers? So if all of these other explorers knew about him and we know about them, how did they or we allow him to be forgotten, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I've often asked myself that. To their credit, guys like Stephenson, who was the leader of the Canadian Arctic expeditions, they were tasked with mapping islands in the high Arctic, and Amundsen, they tried to do their own part to bring Darrell out of the shadows. They paid tribute to them in their own autobiographies, saying this guy was the real legend. He never sought publicity in his own time, but he did things that would blow all the rest of us out of the water. So they did try to bring him to light, and when he vanished, it did make headlines. That was the other thing that was interesting. I went to the New York Times archive and found stories about Darrell's disappearance, and the plot thickened because 2 years after he went missing, they started to discover writing from him carved into trees in the area, the very remote area of the Northwest Territories where he vanished. So it was an incredible story, and it felt like for sure someone should have written a book about this years earlier,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if not made it into a movie. But it just didn't
Well,
happen.
that's it,
And
right? Like
it's just one of the ironies of history that some of the most fascinating stories just happen to slip through the cracks, and can be forgotten about. Darrell himself never had any children, so it wasn't like he had,
oh,
grandkids or great grandkids today, kind of holding on to the family lore, telling this to the tale of
the
uh,
myth.
of Grandpa Darrell who disappeared. He got forgotten in that sense. And, it was a very remote area where he vanished. So the other thing that was really interesting is no one had ever actually gone and searched for him. Unlike Franklin, when
Oh,
Franklin disappeared, it launched dozens of search expeditions, his disappearance, to
yes.
try to unravel it. Now, of course, the circumstances were totally different. Franklin disappeared with 2 ships full of hundreds of sailors. Darrell was a lone man, so he was much less of a priority. But he was in such a remote, isolated area. It was so difficult. And he was the legend. It was years before anyone even really started to suspect he's not coming back. And by that point, the trail had gone cold. No one could really go and look for him. So it was kind of bizarre, but it was like, here I am 100 years later, mounting really the first ever search for Hubert Darrell to figure out what had
Through
happened to this guy.
time, like a true historical, like almost like a time cop story of, and doing, having done some research, getting to a point, or I've done transcribing, like you say, and you're, even as you're looking at the person's writing, I did some of for Igor Stravinsky and Nadia Boulanger, who are famous European musicians of the 20th century, and they had letters of correspondence in French. And I remember just one of my professors who I worked with in my master's transcribing what a hard process that was, the number of hours that took, but also how I felt I almost better knew those characters, or who are people. And I think also the magic of the story, these types of stories, and why they're so attractive to people en masse is, yes, the intrigue, yes, the mystery. It's like Tom Thompson, what happened? Bill Barilko. But it's human. You're making it from something abstract to just like the peregrine falcon. It flies over your house, and if somebody sees, oh wow, they can find that connection as a human. And so, as a human, what did you learn maybe about Hubert, Darrell, from all of this as a person and an explorer? Was there something maybe that fueled him?
Oh, absolutely.
Um,
I mean, absolutely. There are many things about him, and I tried to tell his whole life story. So there was a personal dimension as well. He had a fiance in Manitoba, and Darrell had disappeared in 1910. So I was doing the math, and I'm like, oh man, even if you were like Guinness World Record, oldest person alive today, you'd probably still be too young to have ever known Hubert Darrell, right? Even if I could find a 100-year-old elder, they wouldn't have known Darrell. But I did try to go all over the map from Manitoba to Tuktoyaktuk to find elderly folks who might have remembered not Darrell, no one did, as it turned out, but people who were connected to him. His brother, who continued to farm in Manitoba for decades after his disappearance. I found people who'd known his brother, as well as his fiance, who lived right up until the early 1950s when she passed away
wow.
at a ripe old age. So I actually found an individual named Margaret Ashcroft, who's 90 years old, and she'd actually been born in the Great Depression on the farm adjacent to the Darrell farm in Manitoba. So I ended up going to her farmhouse in Manitoba and sitting down at her kitchen table and telling her, like, I'm interested in this guy, Hubert Darrell. You knew his fiance, you knew his brother. Tell me everything you can about him. And that's in the book as well. Every time I do that, from the Arctic to the prairies, meeting with people, trying to learn, unravel this mystery, I've shared that in the book. So yeah, absolutely. We do try to get inside Darrell's head, put ourselves in his shoes, and really tell his story. What motivated him? What made him tick? How did he find the willpower to go do these journeys? And Darrell, he was born in the 1800s. He came from a humble background. There wasn't a lot of money, and he and his brother had to leave home as teenagers to make ends meet, to find their own way in the world, which today in Canada would seem completely bizarre, right? But it's like 16 years old, you're a man, you've got to go out on your own in the world and try to make a go of it. And that's what had happened to him. And because he was always struggling financially, being a poor Manitoba farmer, it's easy to imagine why, he went north hoping to actually pay off his farm's debts and strike it rich, or somehow make enough money in the north to pay off his family's debt and be able to wed his fiance, with whom he seems to have been madly in love with, and she was madly in love with him. She continued to pine for him ever afterwards. She actually wrote to some of the most famous Arctic explorers in the world after he disappeared, begging them to go search for him, try to figure out what
Oh,
had
wow.
happened. She was the last to really give up hope that he was not coming back. So I've tried to explain all that, but there's something else that I think many people even today can identify with in Darrell's story, which is that elusive, enchanting call of the wild, right? We all know what it is, but it's hard to put into words. What is it about the wilderness that speaks to our hearts and souls and draws us out there, to see what's on the other side of the mountain, or over the next hill, or up the next bend in the river? And Darrell very much was a guy who was captivated by the spell of the beyond, the allure of the wild. And, for him, it wasn't enough just to go to, say, northern Manitoba or the Yukon. He was constantly hungering, thirsting after those really blank spots on the map, which is where the title of the book comes from, Vanish Beyond the Map. He had specifically gone into an area that was uncharted to try to map it beyond any of the existing maps when he vanished. And this was something he had done many times before, but there was something in his lonely soul that those remote faraway places called out to and lured him out there time and time again, and almost like a moth to the flame. In the end, he couldn't resist, and it ended up being his doom. It destroyed him. And I do think I found his final camp, his last place on Earth, where he met his tragic end. And I don't want to spoil the end of the book, but was it ever dramatic?
Yeah.
All the evidence points to this this conclusion, and it's in the book there. But I don't want to spoil the ending of the book.
Yeah, and I don't want you to spoil it, but whatever you have to say, you can go ahead and say. I won't tell. And just because you mentioned Call of the Wild, was the Whisper on the Night Wind, is that in the opening chapter, did you not quote Call of the Wild? Is that not where that title came from?
Close. It's Robert Service, the poet.
Oh, Robert Service.
Who's in the Yukon. Yeah, contemporary of Jack London. I do have Jack London in this book. That's the other thing about Hubert Darrell. So Robert Service was maybe the most famous poet in Canada a century ago. He knew Hubert Darrell, and he admired Hubert Darrell, like everyone in the Yukon. He thought Darrell was a legend. And this is bizarre. When I dug up the old newspaper accounts of his disappearance in the Dawson newspaper or the Alaskan newspapers, it was Robert Service, the famous poet, the guy who wrote like Sam McGee and all that. He was the guy who
the Cremation of Sam McGee.
He was the guy who broke the story of Darrell's disappearance. He was the first guy to bring word that he was missing to the outside world. And this was part of the problem. In that day, news traveled very, very slowly. It was the opposite of today, where we're bombarded with 24-hour news cycles. There was no telegram station in Fort McPherson or any of these other remote places. So news actually had to come south by dog sled, and there would only be one journey a year where the mail would come south on dog sled. And then it would come to Dawson, and they had a telegram station there where they could relay it to the outside world. So this made it even more difficult to try to unravel things. But it was actually Robert Service. He was the guy, the famous poet, who first broke the story that Hubert Darrell, fearless explorer, has gone missing. And, Jack London, did he know Hubert Darrell? It's possible. They were in the North at the same time. Many other big names who were in the Yukon at that time did indeed know him. Some of the most famous Mounties in the Yukon. They were good friends with Hubert Darrell. They knew him well, and he'd actually guided them. He'd led them in the wilderness many times. So yeah, lots of those names, Jack London, Robert Service, come up in the book as well, and how they crossed Darrell's path.
And just as an aside here, I'm trying to remember I'm remembering from Pierre Burton's The Klondike Sam. Was there a Mountie named Sam?
Oh, you're thinking of Sam Steele, probably, yeah.
Sam Steele, but again, at the time, what we think of Mounties now with the hat and the horses, those guys who were sent up to the Yukon during the gold rush, they were, it was, I don't want to, the Wild West, but those Mounties were pretty tough as well, and had to get through quite a bit of mayhem of humanity.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story, but that's the other thing that really comes across when you're trying to reconstruct the world of 100 years ago, especially in a remotest places, Canada's Arctic or North, is how small it was. It's like you're a Mountie there. There is no backup. You can't grab your phone and call for backup. It'd be like, there's 6 Mounties and there's 1,000 angry prospectors, American gold seekers here, and nothing else around for thousands of miles but mountains and snow and bitterly cold minus 40-degree temperatures. So yeah, people were they had to be a lot more self-reliant, a lot more rugged and independent, in the sense that help was not a phone call away. And nobody really personified that more than Darrell, who went out in the wilderness hundreds of miles from anywhere on his own. And that was something that everyone at the time thought was extraordinary. I mean, it didn't matter if you were an Inuit, Dene, Gwich'in, French-Canadian fur trapper, American gold seeker. Everyone kind of traveled in groups. They had friends or partners or families. But Darrell was known, even in his own time, as the lone wolf, this mysterious wanderer who just would disappear. There he goes. He's out on snowshoes. And then like 6 months later, they'd hear that he was on Hudson's Bay. And they're like, how'd you get to Hudson's Bay? I walked. He developed this extraordinary reputation. And he ended up he's credited with saving the lives of hundreds of sailors who get frozen into the Arctic Ocean. They're trapped in the Arctic ice in the Beaufort Sea during the very cold winter of 1906. They'd gone up there to hunt whales, but they couldn't get south in time because the sea froze solid. And they had enough provisions to last for a while, but they were running low, and they couldn't get out. Now, there's no way for them to just, come south. The nearest telegram station's 1,000 kilometers away. There's no trail. There's mountains. There's Arctic darkness. It's the winter. There's no sunrise at those latitudes. But one guy shows up and volunteers to go alone without even sled dogs because the snow is too deep for huskies and travel 1,000 kilometers alone over the mountains to try to save everyone's life, get to the nearest telegram station in Alaska, and send word that the ships are frozen in, that they're running out of provisions, so that hopefully ships can be sent north, sail around the Bering Sea and across the Beaufort Sea and bring them, relief, provisions. And that man, of course, is Hubert Darrell. When he sets off on snowshoes over the mountains alone in the dead of winter in January, everyone thinks, he will never see him again. He's a dead man. There goes him. But he travels with almost superhuman strength, stamina, and speed because he knows literally lives are hanging in the balance. And barely a month later, he's covered 1,000 kilometers over the mountains, and he shows up in this little tiny fur trade post in Alaska. And he comes out of the mountains. I mean, you can barely imagine it. Windswept face, frostbit, huge beard, long hair. This wild guy on snowshoes, encrusted in
The Yeti.
They think he's a phantom. Yeah, like this.
Yeah.
What is this ghost? And he says, here are the dispatches from the whaling captains. They're frozen into the sea. There's not a moment to lose. Send out word. And he rests barely a couple of weeks. They give him word back from the telegram station. He says, okay, now I'll go back all the way to the ships, 1,000 kilometers again, and let them know that I got word out and everything's going to be okay. So, I mean, that's the extraordinary story that is Hubert Darrell, this legend who, again, was, highly admired and respected in the North, across the North in his own time, but had been forgotten about by history.
Mm-hmm. And as you're describing that particular adventure of saving the sailors, there's the story of Togo, again, like Balto, right? And
Yeah.
I think it was Togo, I think, wasn't it?
Right.
And they made it into a movie with Willem Dafoe. And it's a very good movie, a dramatic movie, and speaks to the heart of the Arctic explorer. And I think that's why, again, the Edge with Anthony Hopkins is something that I love. But when you look at that movie and you think, wow, they made a movie about Balto and about this story is just hearing it now, I'm even more excited to get the book and read it because this is exactly what I thirst for in the other books. And I read another upcoming review or something that this book is you nailing everything else that you've done so far into one big amazing volume that is Vanished Beyond the Map. And so from here, just for an example, what would it take, do you think, or is that something that you would ever even consider, is something like this were to be turned into a movie? I don't know.
Yeah, it's not I'm not a movie maker, a filmmaker, so that's beyond my reach. But I mean, theoretically, that's how movies get made. Is someone comes along, reads a book, and says, "Let's buy the rights to the book and turn it into a movie."
Right.
So if someone from Steven Spielberg comes knocking on my door, I'm certainly not going to say no.
Hey, yo, Steve.
Come Vanish Beyond the Map. And I think Togo, the
get off my doorstep.
Yeah, that movie you referenced, Togo. I don't know for sure, but I think it's similar to the Hubert Darrell case, where the dog that was credited in that famous survival story was not the dog that actually did it. So they kind of they tried to bring the real hero to light. And Hubert Darrell is sort of like that as well. I mean, I couldn't even tell you everything that happened in this book. He gets in a fight in the Arctic in the middle of nowhere with a British aristocrat. Another guy who tried to hire him as a guide, a very wealthy sport hunter from New York called Henry Radford. He hears of Darrell's legendary reputation, and he says, I don't care what the price is. I'm going to hire you as my guide. I want you to lead me into the Arctic. I'm a big game hunter. And Darrell says, I don't want anything to do with you. He thinks he's really green and arrogant and won't take him in the Yukon. And that same year that Darrell disappears, Radford goes into the Arctic and he ends up murdered. He gets his throat slit.
Come on.
I know there's all these fascinating stories that are.
It's the greatest story that's never been told.
I know the drama. It practically wrote itself, this book, and wherever possible. I tried to use the original letters, the original diaries, and the original newspaper articles and reproduce them in the book so that the reader can actually see it through the eyes of the people who were there in their own words. This is what's happening. So that's all part of the book. And as I said, October 7th. It's coming out in bookstores all across Canada. You can get it online, Amazon, Indigo, Chapters, Kohl's, independent bookstores. My website has the links. And
AdamShoalts.com, and I'll also be posting more of that as the book comes out too. So of all this, I'll be sure that I'm putting that out there for you too, because again, your work merits and deserves it. This is what you're doing is Canadian history, and you're getting a whole generation of people into something that, again, when I was the kid in grade 7 learning about the coureur de bois, about Jean Talon and the establishment of New France, and I was like, oh, give me more, and other kids seemingly were like, oh. And so having this, you've created for all Canadian historians, and you're creating a pop culture, going back to our previous discussion about Richard Wagner and this idea of a national myth. What do you think maybe the role of myth is, or legend, in your stories or this book? I know that that's something you talked about in your previous books as well. The Whisper on the Night Wind, you talk about mythology and legend, the Loup-garou, which is the werewolf. And so to go back to those books, people can read them. If they haven't, they should, because the outcome of that book was really interesting as well, right? What was it?
right.
Um,
Well, and
and so
the subtitle of that book, The Whisper on the Night Wind, is actually the true history of a wilderness legend. So I did try to take a little bit of skepticism, but not total skepticism. I said, these are legends, these are myths, but they're not entirely fictional. They have a grain of truth behind them, and that's what fascinates me. Is I want to dig down into the roots of these legends and find out what is that true or real thing that inspired the story. And I think there's an element of that, legendary myth making, many different features of history, probably in Darrell's own life. He became a living legend, so you know what it's like. When you've done something like you caught this big muskie, the biggest muskie in the lake, it was this big, it was 40 pound, and then it becomes a 50 pound, then it becomes a 60 pound. So Darrell probably experienced that in his own life among those isolated fur trappers and fur trade posts. Stories of his exploits spread like wildfire, and he probably did become kind of like a Paul Bunyan mythical figure in his own time, but he was one that had vanished from the history books until now, when, of course, I'm trying to bring him back and put him into the history books. And actually, I heard that his hometown in Birtle, Manitoba, because of what I've done here, they're making an exhibit on him in the local museum. And I'm actually going to be going there in a few weeks to do a talk at the museum and help bring his story to out of the shadows. So, yeah, I mean, that's all part of it.
And the pride in the community that you've created, you've awoken a pride in the past. And again, that is identity. And those are all sort of tertiary or secondary outcomes of what you're doing. And through this too, another question I guess I have is, while you do these stories and you're putting them together, do you find that in the region, because a lot of your work is in the Arctic, and as you dig through that, again, sparser areas, has your or have your own experiences and explorations of the Arctic changed your outlooks as a historian, or how you do your work? I mean, because I've never really been there. I don't know if that's a clear question, but maybe through your voyages and as a historian, what has been the biggest lesson on how you curate these histories, maybe?
Probably it's definitely actually going out onto the land. And I don't think this is necessarily the case just with the history of the Arctic, but really anything you're studying, even if you're studying World War II, what have you, any subject under the sun, it really reinforces when you actually get away from the library and the history books, the massive impact geography, the land has on history. So for me, that's front and center. It's kind of like the land or the geography shapes the history. And that was the whole idea behind my book that you held up earlier, A History of Canada in 10 Maps. Let the maps tell the story. So I think
Yep.
that's very true. Canada's history develops around the waterways, the lakes, the canoe routes, the traditional travel routes. That really influences the whole development of the country. And Canada is not Canada if it doesn't have this northern geography. And the same is true of France and its vineyards and its orchards and farmyards and everywhere else in the world, right? So yeah, that's what I would say, is that when you're actually out there sleeping under the stars or paddling a canoe in the river, it really reinforces or brings home to you the massive impact the land itself has on the history. So my history books are a little bit unusual in the sense that the land itself is almost like a character in the book alongside Hubert, Darrell, or Samuel du Champlain. It's the land itself that's actually taking on sort of a starring role in the story, because it's the land that shapes really everything else. And it's front
That's
and
right.
center in all of my books.
climate and where we come from. And that's a big issue, as well as to think, seafaring civilizations more likely to have seafood and those types of things in their culture, and how all of those things are holistically creating us. And I think, without getting, from my point of view as a historian, and I guess I love the psychological aspects too of how culture comes to be. And again, you can't remove that from climate, from geography, because even within Canada, what is Canada in Southern Ontario versus Northern Ontario? It's a very different way of life based on geographical realities.
Right.
And that ultimately explores, and I think that too feeds into, what does it mean to be Canadian? I think part of the reason of starting Canadian Grit and trying to bring these types of stories to life that you've made so beautifully for us to just open, and it doesn't, most people will be like, oh, this is an amazing book, but they don't see the years and the hours that it takes. But I just think it's really important in creating that national cohesion of what does it mean, in a day where there's a lot of politics and different things all over the world going on. But what does it mean to be at home when we have so many different pieces of history and groups of people, anthropology? What is Canada? And I think what you exhibit, from my personal point of view, is that you are keeping the spirit of exploration alive. And in my opinion, that is Canada. That's my subjective opinion, that we've always been explorers. We've never had one identity, all the way back to your history of Canada in 10 maps, all the way back to the earliest maps of the Vikings coming to Labrador. And these places is, who got here? Well, a lot of people, but, Samuel de Champlain, a lot of people will call him a colonizer, but we also pick it apart and say, well, if we look at human history, isn't all exploration considered colonization? And these are the questions, again, that when I read your book, I end up with more questions and more desire to learn about all of the things about Canada that I don't know. And I think that's really special. Just as a little plug to you, and to sort of honor your efforts, that I think even you in your humility wouldn't. I think it's really special what you do, because this is important for Canada and for kids. The fact that you go and do snakes, the 33 types of snakes, you are also appealing to all Canadians and trying to make a creative, cohesive image of that. I think it's powerful.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie.
Yeah, I know you're a busy man, but maybe one of the last things is, just as a question, if I were to say to you, because I think this is just interesting, because trying to show youth and other people that they can make changes in their life and they can pursue dreams, and that, that some people might look at what you do as quote unquote crazy. You might hear this, right? Do people come to you and say, what are you doing, right? Do people think you're crazy? Maybe speak to that. And crazy, maybe not the good word, but do you see yourself as an influencer? And in this day of digital media, and this is what's really funny, is because I think it's important that I want to call you an influencer, because you're somebody who's showing people how things can be better or done or understood, as opposed to trying to change them. You're allowing people to come to their own realizations. You're promoting critical thinking. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And I really want to make that explicit, because that's what this is. History is an active and democratic participation. And you are an active person who is bringing important stories of humanity to keep that going. So in all of that is, are you an influencer? And so when people say to you, are you obviously, you go to these places, do you get scared? Why do you do it? Because I look at you and I'm like, man, I want to do these things and to explore. So what makes you want to do it? And it's got to be for yourself, like you said at the beginning, right? Because if you don't have the passion, you wouldn't be able to do any of this.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think I've ever used the word influencer to describe myself. I don't really think of that as...
I figured you wouldn't. I thought you might laugh.
Well,
but that's
I guess I'm old-fashioned in the sense that I think of myself as really just a writer, an author, a guy who loves the outdoors and the woods. But I guess, technically I have Instagram and I have Facebook. I don't post probably nearly as much as what a true influencer would do. But
you're too busy. It's hard
with some degree of irony. talking on a video stream. One of my key messages I try to get across, especially whenever I'm at a school as a guest speaker, is just trying to awaken in every kid a sense of wonder for the natural world, and get away a little bit from the digital screens, and get out into the outdoors, whether it's a local park or a bigger camping trip. I think it's something that speaks to almost all of us as humans, regardless of where we come from. There's something about the great outdoors that resonates with us, and that's probably because for the vast majority of our human history, our ancestors lived under the stars. They lived in the great outdoors. And I think now more than ever, with AI and increasing digitization, more and more video games in our lives being lived online, it's important that we try to take steps as a society to influence, to use that word, to get people of all ages, but especially kids, those opportunities to get outdoors and fall in love with exploring, finding that patch of wild blackberries and getting to eat the thing you foraged yourself out in the wild, or finding that, rare species of queen snake up in the tree, or who knows, maybe dreaming one day of going out into the Arctic and finding a lost explorer. Who knows, maybe that Adam Shoalts guy, and he finally disappeared in the Arctic, and 100 years my
Don't say
bones.
that. I will.
Uh,
I will come for you, sir.
yeah,
I will. I will
but
come for you. I will get snowshoes and I will find you.
well, that's the idea. I've inspired you. I've influenced you to do it. So the idea is,
There you go.
getting
Yes.
kids, that there's nothing holding you back. People ask me that all the time. I want to do what you do, but I don't know where to start. How do I do it? And I always say the same thing, which sounds
Do
like
you
a
know how to
joke, but it's
paddle?
not. But I just say, put your boots on and your backpack and go. That's the single biggest obstacle, is you actually just have to go. It doesn't matter where you're going or what you're doing. In the beginning, I didn't know either. Just get out there, go canoeing, go
Put
find.
some towels up on your wall.
Exactly. Go find a
Yeah.
moose.
Yeah.
Have fun, and the pieces will fall into place. You'll learn more by doing, and you'll get more experience, and you'll figure out a path. And that's half the whole fun of the adventure, is not knowing where you're going or exactly what you're going to do. Some of the best adventures are the ones that aren't planned, but it's just having the sort of push you need, or the courage to take that first step and get out there. And it's all relative. Maybe a 2-day camping trip in the backcountry is a 4-month adventure for someone else, and that's fine. It's just a matter of getting out there and experiencing all that this world has to offer in the great outdoors. And that's partly what I'm trying to do through my books, is to get kids inspired to want to go out there, and people of all ages, obviously.
And that's why I'm here too, and why I really appreciate you being here. Um, you mentioned one thing about Hubert Darrell having carved in the trees. I wanted to ask you that, not to lose the flow of our discussion here, but did you what did he write, or did you find any of those while you were on your voyage?
Yeah, so he didn't carve. I shouldn't have said carved. He didn't carve it in with a
No, no, no.
knife.
Well, maybe I miss.
Well, I did say that. It was like a
Oh,
blaze.
okay.
So the tree had been cut,
Oh,
spruce
blazed
tree,
it. I
had been
see.
cut with a hatchet, so it was a smooth surface. And then he actually had written on the tree, in pen or pencil. He'd written on the tree like a smooth blaze. So that had faded away. It's not there to be found anymore.
I see.
But I actually did find the archival source, like this old letter that had been collecting dust for 100 years, by a guy who had read the writing and what it was. And it was a message, very important message, recording the date when the ice had broken up and where he went. And this was actually not uncommon in an age before emails and text messages to do that in the North. As bizarre as it sounds, people would write down on a spot where it would be seen, like a blaze on a tree or a rock with charcoal,
Oh,
who they were and where they were going. Like Hatchet Jack headed west, May 4th, for Mackenzie
almost
River. He did something like
like
that.
breadcrumbs.
Exactly.
Oh,
So that was
oh.
important to me in the 21st century here, retracing his route, because I actually went there with my canoe and traveled west, retracing his steps. I knew he went this way, and I knew approximately where he was when he vanished. And it was just a process of elimination, canoeing through those lakes and rivers in the Western Arctic, and figuring out where his final campsite was. So that was all part of the mystery too.
That's amazing. And so with all of this coming out, your book's coming out October 7th today, within a week.
Yeah.
Your book's going to be coming out. So what are your plans for the book launch? You've mentioned you can get it at Kohl's, Chapters, Indigo, basically anywhere, or on your website.
Independent bookstores,
Uh,
Amazon, you name it. Yeah.
there you go. So it's going to be everywhere.
Oh, and I
So
should also say, before I forget, It's also available in audio book format. So for people who'd rather listen, there is an audio book, and that comes out at the same time, October 7th.
Did you narrate it?
Yes, I did.
Oh wow, good for
Yeah.
you. You have a podcast voice, sir.
Well, thank you.
You're gonna be putting me out of business here very shortly.
I won't be starting a podcast anytime soon, so you have nothing to worry about.
You could have Adam live from the Arctic,
Yeah.
right? Chatting with polar bears. And so as part of that, when you're going out and doing that, what are some of the bigger things coming for you? So you mentioned going to Manitoba for Hubert Darrell's opening of the museum, or do you have any other big particular engagements as part of the launch that you do?
Yes, I'll be doing as many book signings and book talks and doing slideshows featuring photos and video clips from my own expeditions in the Arctic, retracing Darrell's life, all across Ontario and a few in Manitoba this fall. All those details are on my website, but yeah, I'm going to be all over the map: Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, Ottawa, Hamilton, Toronto, Niagara. I'm trying to cover as much ground as I can. I always joke the easy part is writing a book. The hard part is actually selling the book, which is what I have to do now, because if I can sell a few copies, then I can get the funds I need to keep doing adventures. So that's the idea. But yeah, all those details are on my website as well.
The last thing was I saw that you also do guided walks.
Yeah.
Did you want to just speak to that as well? And just for people in Southern Ontario, you do trail hikes and other walks. I just wanted to put that out there in case people in the area. I have friends from Font Hill. A shout out to my friend Kelly, who's encouraged me, pushed me for years. I said I would love to one day start a podcast. A dream would be to someday talk to Sir Adam Shoalts. This day is happening for me. So there have been some people who have pushed me to make this happen, and so that's really exciting. But the guided hikes, I'm sorry. So because she lives in that area too, I would love people who are anywhere near you in Ontario. Where do you do those and how often?
I do them only once a year. It's a special thing, just an annual hike in the fall. Because actually another passion of mine is wild mushrooms. So if you like wild mushrooms, that's my forte, and I teach people how to identify wild mushrooms and plants. And I actually do them all over Ontario. I changed the location. So I do have one in Algonquin. Last year I did the Mattawa River in Samuel du Champlain Provincial Park up near North Bay. And I've done Temagami as well. And yes, I do have one down on the Niagara River, although that's more of a history hike, less of a wild plant hike, although I still talk about the plants we come across. And that's just once a year. So the hikes this year are pretty much sold out because I try to keep them in small groups to make it special.
I see.
But I have it on my website year round so people can inquire and sign up. And I'm going to try out some new locations next year, most likely. But it's a once a year thing in the fall. The fall is the best time. We got beautiful fall colors, no bugs. And that's when all the mushrooms are out. So that's when I like to do them. And yeah, they're 4-hour hikes and people seem to have a lot of fun on them. I've done them for 7 straight years now. And yeah, there's that. All that stuff's on my website. But thank you very much, Jamie, for having me as a guest and getting this chance to talk to you.
No, thank you for coming, because again, this is my pleasure, and congratulations on your new book. Congratulations on making all this happen, on unboxing it, and within a week, your new book's coming out. And I'm going to be telling everybody about it. There are a lot of people who are interested in your stuff, and I think you're giving Canadians something that, and I've got a bookmark right here from Indigo saying the world needs more Canada. And that's absolutely something I agree with, and that's something I'm trying to do in my own right. And I would just like to thank you, sir, for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule and all of the things that you're doing. As a current and fellow historian, I just would like to say thank you for what you're doing for the field of Canadian history and what you're doing to inspire the next generation of Canadians and for inspiring me. And I thank you for your time. And if you ever would like to come back to Canadian Grit, you will always have a seat and somewhere to talk. So whoever you're chasing down next in the north, or if you want to talk about it, we would love to hear from you.
Well, my pleasure. Yeah. May our paths cross again. Thank you very much, Jamie.
Absolutely. Yeah. Take care of yourself, Adam, and all the best to your family and your kids. Thank you for making time today.
Same to you, Jamie.
Take care.